right, good morning and welcome to the Kickoff Plenary for the 2021 California Adaptation Forum. My name is Julia Kim and I'm joining you from the ancestral lands of the Mwekma Ohlone people, and I'd like to pay respect to elders both past and present. I'm also the Climate Change and Energy Program Director with the Local Government Commission and will be serving as your moderator for today's webinar. As we hear from our speakers and their responses for hope despite the worsening impacts of climate change and historic and ongoing injustice, we also want to hear from you. So what brings you hope? We hope you can join us on menti.com using the code 3254330 to share with us your own reasons for hope as you work to build community resilience and advance climate adaptation efforts. We have this code on some of the next slides, so I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving along. You can see the link in the code right at the bottom of the screen here. So the California Adaptation Forum, or CAF, is hosted by the Local Government Commission in partnership with the Governor's Office in Planning and Research. While CAF is typically organized as a biennial conference in person, we also wanted to find a way to bring California's adaptation community together in a virtual setting so that we can continue fostering knowledge exchange, innovation, and mutual support. This year, CAF is being organized, as many of you know, as a 5-month virtual series focused on the Grand Adaptation Challenge. So how should decision makers invest in and support California's Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to build community resilience in a way that addresses historic and ongoing inequities? How can we better prepare for near-term disasters while also building adaptive capacity for longer-term changes? And how can we translate broad adaptation strategies into more specific metrics and projects? And then how do we finance that, as well as larger landscape level adaptation solutions? We'll be exploring these questions and more through a series of informative webinars and interactive workshops in 3 cross-cutting tracks that you see in front of you: advancing equitable adaptation, integrated planning for holistic solutions, and catalyzing meaningful adaptation action. I also want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors for making CAF 2021 possible, and a special shout out to our champion level sponsor, Southern California Edison. We encourage you to learn more about the programs and resources that our sponsors offer that can support you in advancing climate adaptation initiatives in your own communities. And to our sponsors, thank you again for your partnership. So we have an exciting agenda planned for today's webinar. We'll first hear an original poem from our youth artist, Kimura Knight, specially created for this kickoff plenary. We'll then hear from LGC's Mace, Wright and OPR's Nuantara Key, who will be providing welcoming remarks. We're excited to have Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia join us to provide keynote remarks. And we'll then turn our attention to our panelists. We have Secretary Wade Crowfoot, who oversees the California Natural Resources Agency, Jessica Calderon with Sacred Places Institute, and Lil Milagro Henriquez with Mycelium Youth Network. We'll then wrap up with a panel discussion where Nuantara will be joining our panelists to answer questions from all of you. So on that note, we encourage you to use the Q&A module at any point during the webinar to submit questions for our panelists. You can also upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button for questions that you're also interested in hearing responses to. We also encourage you to use the chat function to engage with other participants. Feel free to jump in the chat. Folks should have full access there. And if you're encountering any technical issues or if you have questions about CAF more generally, please chat John Vandervoort. I also want to take a moment to give a huge thanks to John and Kelsey Wolfcloud for their hard work in making CAF 2021 a reality. Truly, thanks you too. This wouldn't be possible without you. And as another reminder to all of our participants, we would love to hear from you. As you work to build community resilience and advance climate adaptation efforts, what brings you hope? You can share with us here. If you go to menti.com and enter the code 3254330. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Kimura Knight, the author, multidisciplinary artist, and advocate for justice. Kimura Knight uses artivism, art and activism, to heal and grow consciousness. A few notable moments include singing with Kristen Chenoweth on Broadway, performing and protesting at the Kennedy Center, and modeling for Callan Lord, a community healthcare center. Her training is vast, garnering credentials with Urban Word NYC, Sing Harlem Choir, Girl Be Heard, and more. A certified teaching artist and cycling mentor, Kimura is also a music major at BMCC. She vows life is not worthy without the sharing of creation and urges you all to remember Black mental health matters. So thank you so much, Kimura, for being with us here today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me, Julia. Good morning, panelists and attendees. As mentioned, my name is Kimura Knight, and today I will perform my poem, Something Grows. Something grows like fire, wild like flowers thirsting for bloom. Everything changes. That is true. Look up. Our sky's hue is askew, and I know this country always acted a little colorblind, but smoke and chokeholds still hurt the same. We all need to breathe. Sow seeds of factuality over fakeness, a flash of news. Without nature, we really wouldn't see air. Out of place sentiments over a space granted to us. Don't think of Mars. Take care of home first. Typically, tragedies act as the catalyst. Ponder, perhaps the pandemic was kismet. Earth receiving reparations for years of oppressive humanship, the wind was cleansed. Birds higher than societal expectations. This world is ready for transformation. Thus, let 2020 be our bittersweet blessing, anointing a new decade with wider sight, going in as witness, both needing each other more than admitted, and needing ourselves unlike we ever permitted. You truly do matter. If every vote deserves a count, considered steps can only heal, sealing the deal that talk was too cheap to cash in on. The power of blistering green leaves palpable scent, nature's perfume, the best payment, a confirmation that just like any living thing, one most benefits by allowing another to flourish. Something grows, like following counts, for change in direction. Perceptions of what to do constantly flicker gray. We all know there will come no knight in shining armor to maintain our fortress. The forests have been pleading our names for our sakes and honor over what we're birth-written to receive. Do you feel the shifting breeze? As the sun, we watch the sea rise over the horizon like a tightrope. We're wavering between fears of drowning, drought, or salvation, only rescuing the elite, competing for which hill to not die on. Bygones be bygones until the swan song is stuck in your loved one's throat. No matter to laugh over whether you believe it or not, you and your enemy's blood both stain. Fable. In a hospital parking lot stood a tree with a remedy while many went inside, only some to receive. Is this how it should be? Similarities seen, look at the soil beneath death and grass, fathom the sheen of its fertility, innovation and holistics, each to build our health, villainized and weaponized, shaking our wealth. Scales been unbalanced, but we're still worth weighing the odds towards an elixir for this ecosystem. Do you recognize what has been done? Awareness is the education. Accountability becomes foundational to responsible conceptualization. I'm saying, if we cannot undo, unite, constructing a new vision, hold the torch to light each other's way, carry water when time to clear flame. Only way out is by knowing we are all in it. Unique journeys within the same jungle. Thank you. That was Something Grows.
Thank you so much, Kimura. If we were gathered in person, there would be a huge round of applause. That was really beautiful. I encourage our participants who joined us to please join me in thanking Kimura. I've had the pleasure of connecting with her yesterday, and she truly is a really bright young artist, great energy, great spirit, and she wrote this piece originally and especially for this event. So thank you again, Kimura, for joining us and sharing that beautiful poem. We see a flood of folks chiming in through the chat. Thanks everyone for joining me. And
You're so kind. I appreciate all of you.
Of course. Virtually, we have to do what we can to uplift one another. I also just realized that my headset was not connected during the entire logistics portion. So hopefully I'm loud enough that folks were able to hear me when I covered some of those pieces, but feel free to chat me if you have any questions. So next, want to thank both Kate and Nuantara for joining us to provide welcoming remarks. Kate Mace Wright is Executive Director of the Local Government Commission, or LGC, and launched many of LGC's pioneering programs, including CAF, Civic Spark, and the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA. Kate is a Senior Fellow of the American Leadership Forum and has been recognized for her climate change work by the Chronicle of Philanthropy as one of the nation's 40 under 40 young leaders who are solving the problems of today and tomorrow. We'll also hear from Nuantara. Nuantara Key is a Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, and the Chair of the Technical Advisory Committee for the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. Prior to joining OPR, Nuantara co-founded an international initiative on community-based climate action and has worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors on sustainable urban and regional planning and policy, with a special focus on social equity and climate change. Thank you both for joining us here today. And Kate, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the California Adaptation Forum. Thank you for being here, and a big thanks to all our sponsors who've made this event possible, and to our staff, to Julia, to our volunteers, and everyone who helped us put this together. We really appreciate it. We have a great program for you over the next 5 months, a little bit of a different format, and I certainly miss being with you all in person, but we will get there again, and we've all had to act and figure out resilience over the last 16 months, so we're all doing it together. So our themes this year of advancing equitable adaptation and catalyzing meaningful adaptation action and integrated planning for holistic solutions could not be more prescient. The last 16 months of the pandemic have highlighted how broken our current systems are. We know we can't go back to the status quo, and we don't want to, and we can't boost the economy in ways that would continue to lead us into further health and equity crises. It's imperative that we move into a season where we prioritize equity, sustainability, and resilience. And I love that, Kimura, just beautiful poem. And as she said, the world is ready for transformation. And I believe that we have a completely different appetite for the type of change that we've been talking about. With unprecedented level of state budget surplus, with recovery funding, with the anticipation of infrastructure investments, we have what I believe is a once in a generation opportunity to move away from the incrementalism that has plagued this work towards truly transformative, integrated climate equity and resilience initiatives. At the LGC, we work to support local leaders to do just that. And I'm just realizing, if we want to move on to the next slide, that would be great. We work to do just that, connecting leaders through events like this, like the California Adaptation Forum. We work to support integrated and holistic solutions by advancing policies and implementing those solutions with technical assistance across climate change, community design, energy, water, and national service. We're happy to support your adaptation work through a couple of our keystone programs. The Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA, is a coalition program of the Local Government Commission and is supported by our friends at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, who serve as ARCA's state liaison. ARCA represents 7 regions throughout California, which in total encompass over 80% of the state's population, and also has a number of leading organizations and institutions. Together, we work to advance adaptation through knowledge exchange, and you can advance to the next slide, and acceleration of adaptation policies, support for emerging regional collaboratives, and coordination between state, regional, and local entities. We also support your adaptation initiatives through Civic Spark. a governor's initiative AmeriCorps program that we launched in partnership with California volunteers and the Office of Planning and Research to build local climate resilience capacity. Over the past 7 years, nearly 400 Civic Spark Fellows have completed 500 projects in almost 200 communities across the state. If you're interested in getting support on a range of climate resiliency projects, you can apply and find out more at civicspark.lgc.org. And of course, we will continue to use the Adaptation Forum as a platform to help California stand with our frontline communities and community-based organizations to build the equitable, resilient future that we all aspire to. We know that taking proactive steps now to adapt to climate change is the only way that we can protect our most vital resources and position Californians for a prosperous future. So thank you for being here and for your commitment to this work. And we are very much looking forward to rich dialogues and discussions over the next few months. So thank you, and I will turn it back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm actually going to just quickly turn it right over to Nuantara Key, who's joining us from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. It's very exciting to be kicking off the 2021 plenary for CAF here this year. I also want to just start off by first introducing myself. I'm Nuantara Key, Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I now want to start and thank the Local Government Commission for your partnership over the years in elevating climate resilience and supporting collaborative local and regional implementation and action across the state. I also want to thank LGC for your partnership over the years on the California Adaptation Forum. OPR has been the state partner since 2014, and over the years, CAF has truly been an important event, really supporting a community of practice and an ever-growing community of practice around climate adaptation and resilience across the state. So thank you very much for your partnership and everything you do to make California a more resilient and just place. So through our office, the Office of Planning and Research, we run the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, which is charged with aligning local, regional, and state efforts on climate adaptation and resilience, but really with an eye towards supporting local implementation. And under that kind of umbrella and charge, I want to highlight 3 cross-cutting priorities that guide and inform our work and that really align the 3 CAF theme, align with the themes for today's, for this year's CAF. So the first, as set out in our enabling statute that created ICARP, is to ensure that our climate adaptation actions are driving equitable outcomes across the state and within communities in California. We know that climate change is a risk multiplier and exacerbates existing inequities that exist within communities. And we recognize that California will not be resilient if we leave communities behind. So advancing equity, one of the key themes for this year's CAF, is really central to our approach in how we think about aligning our efforts on adaptation and resilience through our office. One quick highlight of some work that we are doing in our office specifically focused on this is our work that we're all very excited about to build a platform to help us better understand who is vulnerable to climate risk and why. And so we really look forward to the conversation that comes through CAF this year to help inform and guide our work around that priority. The second cross-cutting priority that informs and guides our work is supporting an integrated approach to climate, hence the integrated in the title of our program. And what that means to us is supporting climate solutions that both reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also build resilience and support adaptation to the impacts Californians are already facing across the state and within communities. And so the theme of integrated planning and really driving on a systems approach to adaptation and resilience, and also thinking about how we convene and bring communities together to find the solutions that are urgently needed is a key priority for us. One of the ways that we drive on this priority through our program is through our ICARP, our Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program Council. And the council really guides and informs our work and brings together both state leaders, local communities, community-based organizations, and private sector that are really bringing communities together in a platform to discuss and understand what are the challenges and opportunities as we're working to drive on resilience and adaptation. And finally, the third cross-cutting priority that is also reflected in the theme for this year's CAF is advancing a whole of government approach to climate, one that recognizes implementing our ambitious goals and targets requires implementation across not only all of state government, but really across all sectors and scales. So the Newsom administration from day one has been committed to a whole of government approach on climate and really looking forward to seeing what comes through the theme around catalyzing meaningful action here in this year's California Adaptation Forum to support that agenda and approach. So I want to thank everyone who is going to participate in the virtual 2021 CAF for your thought leadership and partnership to help us advance each of these priorities. And with that, I want to close by thanking the panel who's going to be joining us here today and all of the leadership that they have shown for decades here in this arena. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Nu and Tara. Really appreciate you joining us and for OPR's ongoing partnership on CAF and so many other important programs for climate adaptation throughout California. So for folks who are just joining us, I want to remind y'all that we have that Mentimeter poll going. Would love to hear from you, reasons that bring you hope. Do a quick show of what we currently have. And it looks like youth and community and collaboration are really floating to the top. But we'd love to continue seeing what other reasons folks have that bring you hope as you work to build community resilience and advance climate adaptation efforts. So again, you can go to menti.com, enter the code 3254330, and we would love to hear from you. We just heard from Assemblymember Garcia's scheduler that he is stuck in session and won't be able to join us, unfortunately. So, which was not completely unexpected. So with that, we're going to actually adapt the agenda a little bit ourselves. So I'm excited to introduce some of our panelists. We might go slightly out of order than what we intended, but really excited to hear from folks. Let me get that page up. All right, and in a moment, Secretary Crowfoot will be joining us, but first would love to hear from our other two esteemed panelists. We have Jessica Calderon joining us. She is the coordinator of Indigenous Oceans and Waters Protector Program for Sacred Places Institute. Jessica is also a songwriter, a poet, a hip hop artist and performer, a hypnotherapist, an energy worker. The list truly goes on, juggling multiple hats. Jessica encourages Indigenous communities and youth to find their healing mentally, physically, and spiritually through their words, music, and practices. I'm so grateful to have you here with us, Jessa. And we'll also hear from Lo Milagro Henriquez, who is the founder and executive director of Mycelium Youth Network, an organization dedicated to preparing and empowering frontline youth for climate change. She's a veteran of social justice organizing with over 20 years of experience working on a myriad of issues, including access to higher education for low-income people and communities of color, food sovereignty, environmental racism, union democracy, and labor organizing, among others. So two stellar community leaders who have clearly been very busy. They're both also PACE leaders with the inaugural cohort of the Partners Advancing Climate Equity program. So really excited to have you both join us. And Jessa, I'll turn it over to you first, and we'd love to hear from you.
I'm here. I'm just trying to situate my camera. There it goes. Okay. Maiha Wanahinkam, Natwanyane, Jessica Calderon, and I want to thank you, Julia, for having me on here. So I am Tongva as well as Chumash, and those are California Native American nations. Some of you may not have heard of Tongva, but if you've ever heard of Los Angeles, then you should know who we are. I would like to start by giving you an idea of what life may have been like here beforehand. So if any of you have been to Los Angeles, and if you've ever seen the Los Angeles River, you know it's just this concrete trail with water that goes through it, and it's pretty gross. But if you can, with me for a second, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and see a beautiful natural river flowing, strong, clear, and see fish jumping out of that water. See a salmon jumping out of that water. And if you look across the river, notice that grizzly bear hunting for the salmon along the river. And go ahead and turn to your right and take a walk close by the river and hear how strong, how powerful she is. And as you continue on your journey down the river, you glance over and you see a tule boat coming up the river with 3 Tongva relatives paddling back to their village. And you look up to see the village with the smoke coming from the kitchen, where the women are cooking their acorn mush for the little children running, playing, and singing. Smell the beautiful smells of the food. And look around and see the lush green and all the water of Los Angeles. And welcome to my home. So 100 years ago, we lost our grizzly bear. We lost our wolves. Within that time frame, we began to lose our salmon, our trout. We have been displaced people here in Los Angeles. We are not a federally recognized tribe. Therefore, people see us as not real. People see us as non-existent. We are landless. So all of our homes have been taken. We've been displaced, and now homes are going in the ghettos, if you will, for $700,000. I can't afford a home in my own ancestral homeland. So as we get into 2021 and people are waking up, right? They're in the woke stage. I have hope that we start holding the proper people accountable, the banks who are making it impossible for people to live in my homeland, which causes houselessness. And if you've been to Los Angeles, you know that houselessness is a huge issue. So raising the prices to homes in Los Angeles is not going to benefit this situation. That's a huge problem. We talk about the loss of water, that we're in a drought, but still we see these developers building and building and building. We need water for development of these buildings. So we need to open our eyes to the reality. And when we open our eyes to the reality and we live for the people instead of the profit, that is when we will see the benefits. When we live for the animals instead of the profit, that's when we'll see beauty. So my hope is really that as we wake up in 2021, we begin to put the people first. We begin to put the animals in the proper position, which is next to us, the plant life in the proper position, which is next to us. And we begin to understand in the indigenous aspect that these plants are our relatives and not resource, that these animals are our relatives and not enemies, that the water is our relative and not a resource. And when we begin to see everyone as connected to us and not us above anything, that is when we will see genuine love and healing. And so my hope for us all is that we see each other, that we understand each other, and that we stop living in the corporate America that we've been forced into and start taking the proper steps into living in the Turtle Island that the indigenous people had been taking care of all along. The paradise, as many people have written in their journals when they first got to our homelands, that it once was. And in order to understand that, we have to have relationships with the indigenous people to understand how to get there. So again, that word hope, the hope is to have the people of the ancestral areas in California at these tables, the Karuk up north, the Kumeyaay down south, and every nation in between, and not just one indigenous person to check the box, because we're not a box to be checked, but we are a peoples who want to help you to heal the earth so that we can live for the next 7 generations, and that we can ensure that they're not suffering for our greed, for lack of a better word. So I want to send you all in a good way and just send you so much love, and hope that you can accept that love with an open heart and an open mind, and really see what California could get back to and all the beauty it ever was before we turned it into a desert that it wasn't. Because again, Los Angeles was a lush green place with a lot of wetland, and it's our responsibility as the people with the thumbs. It is our responsibility to care for the land, to care for the animals, to care for the plants, and to care for one another. So I love you, I see you, I appreciate you, and I hope that you can do the same with the rest of your brothers and sisters, including the plants and the animals. Awesh Koneha, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessa, for those very loving remarks and those really important reminders. Okay, next we'll hear from Milagro. We've had folks chiming in through Mentimeter, and I'll chat that in the Zoom portal now. And youth has been coming up to the top, so super happy that you're able to join us. And with that, I'll just turn it right over to you.
Wali Tonali. Hello, everyone. My name is Lil Milagro Enriquez, and I am a detribalized descendant of Nahuatl Pipil peoples from Atiquizaya, which is Cutzatlan, Atiquizaya Cutzatlan, which is now known as El Salvador. And I come to you from unceded Ohlone territory. And you know, when I think about youth, and I always think about one of the first stories that I share with the young people that we serve at Mycelium Youth Network, an organization that I created in 2017 to support young people in being prepared for climate change. And one of the things that we do first with our young people is share the stories of our history and of our own people. And so I want to be able to share that with you today, and then talk about that importance of sharing those ancestral stories with our young people so that they do not feel so alone in this moment that we are in. And so I think back to my own family from Atiquizaya Cutzatlan. I think back through my matrilineal lineage and of my great-grandmother who watched the systematic stripping away of old growth forest. Only 15% of old growth forest is left in El Salvador, or less than 15,000 acres. And my great-grandmother who watched with bated breath as US warships were stationed off the coast of El Salvador at the turn of the century. I think of that great-grandmother who sang traditional songs to my grandmother in Nahuatl and who raised her amongst those last old growth forests. I think of my grandmother who lived through La Matanza, which is the great killing of Nahuatl Pipil's peoples of Nahuatl and Lenca peoples on her land, as the government butchered people that looked just like her. I think of the tears that she cried as she watched Donansing, or Mother Earth, her land that they relied on for food, that they had a relationship with, destroyed and poisoned, a legacy that still lives today when more than 50% of land in Cutzatlan, El Salvador is unsuitable for food production. I think of my mother who prayed alongside Monsignor Romero with visions of liberation theology, where the poor would come first. I think of her who left her own homeland to migrate to New Orleans to plant her family tree and where I was born. And I speak these stories into existence and commit them to memory so that I can share them both with my own children and with the young people that we serve. And this is always the place that we start with young people, is to let them know that they are not alone. That when they come into this world, they're coming from a history, from a legacy of resistance and resilience, as they themselves are experiencing the ecological, as we collectively, but that young people see the ecological deforestation, the destruction, at a time when young people's suicides are at an all-time high, when they're choosing not to have children because they are so scared of the world and what will come. We tell them these stories, these legacies of our own history of resistance, so that they know that they are not alone. They are not alone. And when I think of the power then that they take when they hear those stories, when they recognize that this moment that they came into existence in is both fraught with tremendous amounts of danger, as well as tremendous possibility that they are not alone, that they are walking with the collective power of their ancestors, of their parents, of their great-grandparents, who have consistently tried to freedom dream another world into existence. And I see now the way that young people are taking that place of possibility and are creating tremendous transformation with it. And so many of the greatest movements of our times and of our previous generations have actually come from young people taking on the legacy of their ancestors, being able to create positive choice, being able to ask those difficult questions in a way that cuts through the pretense, the status quo, the business as usual model that adults, as we get older and older and older, we think are entrenched and unstoppable. I see the ways in which young people cut through that with truth, with honesty, the ways that they bring forward their own vision of a different world, and the ways that they are creating so much hope. Movements like the Uprising in Ferguson, the March for Our Lives, Standing Rock. On the climate change front, we see that in the Fridays for the Future, the Earth Guardians movement, Youth versus Apocalypse, and more. And I also see the ways that they take this moment and they also rejected the adultism of just being considered inspirational. I see the way that they are pushing adults around them, ourselves included, to be able to take radical stances against climate change, because that is the moment that we are in, is where we need to start dreaming bigger than we've ever dreamt before, where we need to start taking in our own histories, our own legacies, reckoning with those whenever possible, and rooting our own resilience in that place. And so I just want to say that, like, young people, that youth are coming and are creating inspirational change, and they are not just empty vessels to be filled full of knowledge. They are the dreamers, the visionaries, the architects of a new future that they want to build. And we as adults need to be strong enough and courageous enough to build those worlds with them. So Wali Tonali, thank you so much. Tonansing, thank you so much for letting me be here to be able to share these words with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lil. I mean, where would we be without the young people who have been, like you said, really pushing this movement forward? Certainly not where we are today. So appreciate you joining us and giving us a glimpse into some of your work and the importance of and the power of youth. And with that, we're excited to have Secretary Wade Crowfoot join us. Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of 19,000 employees who protect and manage California's natural resources. This includes the state's forests and natural lands, rivers and waterways, coasts and oceans, fish and wildlife, and energy development. As a member of the governor's cabinet, he also advises the governor on natural resources and environmental issues. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass it over to you, Secretary.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I just want to acknowledge the powerful words of both Jessa and Lil, and the need to make space and make time to listen and learn from both young leadership and our Indigenous leadership. I lead an agency called the Natural Resources Agency that was built over the better part of 100 years in a very traditional paradigm that viewed our nature, our environment as economic resources. And I appreciate Jessa's call to transcend that paradigm as I understand it, and to recognize other living things within California, within our planet, as essentially equal cohabitants. And we're focused on really changing the paradigm. Obviously, we live in a state of 40 million people and the 5th largest economy in the world. And we do support our prosperity and our community livelihoods through the use of water and elements within our environment. But we're increasingly focused on lifting up nature, restoring nature, both for the benefit of our biodiversity and our plants and animals, to expand access so that all Californians can equitably enjoy this incredible environment. And of course, because we are now amidst the climate crisis. This adaptation forum, as I remember several years ago, started trying to lift up this discussion around climate adaptation. And at the time, this notion of climate adaptation was so much of a future planning exercise, looking down the road several decades in the future and trying to anticipate and understand how climate change would impact our lives in California. Well, we all know that climate change and its impacts have accelerated greatly. And what was once a fairly wonky future planning exercise is now a matter of urgent actions to protect public health, to build equity, and to protect California's communities and natural places. We're amidst our second major drought in a decade that threatens our native fish populations as well as the livelihoods of people that work in agriculture. We're bearing down the another very dangerous wildfire season. Just the 1 year after we experienced the worst catastrophic wildfire season in the state's 170-year history. And of course, so many communities from California are burdened by extreme dangerous heat. Many of these communities being disproportionately burdened by other environmental impacts as well. Not to mention the ever-present threat of flooding in the winter and sea level rise and coastal erosion. So the work of climate adaptation has never been more urgent or more central to our work across the state and in Sacramento. I think the good news is that communities across the state and regions across the state have been working for quite a while to build climate resilience. And I'll argue that it's really the regions that have been driving climate resilience across the state. State government needs to listen and learn from both the challenges within each region and the opportunities, and then to fund and support through policy and programs that regional resilience. Different parts of our state are impacted by climate change very differently. So the notion of some one size fits all approach to climate resilience just does not work in California. Instead, we've worked to embrace a model of regional resilience led by local communities. And increasingly, not only local community groups or local governments, I should say, but local community leaders and groups, again, that are most vulnerable to these climate impacts. We know that many communities in California are particularly vulnerable to these climate change impacts. And so not only is our effort, climate adaptation efforts focused on near-term actions that we can take to protect people in natural places, but it needs to focus disproportionately on the most vulnerable communities. So I'm very encouraged that our increased efforts to build our climate resilience are dovetailing with the governor, the legislature's commitment to build much more equity across our economy and our communities. So if we advance a climate action agenda to reduce pollution and protect California that doesn't lift up the need to advance equity and really reshape investments and emphasis towards the most vulnerable communities, then we will fail. So I'm excited to be here simply to underscore our commitment, both in our agency and across the Newsom administration, to deepen, strengthen, accelerate our work together to build climate resilience and to lift up those voices that have been marginalized throughout our history and our institutions, and to ensure that they're at the center of this work to actually build our community resilience and the resilience of our natural places. So glad to be with you today and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Secretary Crowfoot. It's really heartening to hear from you as a state leader. It's just the importance of centering adaptation efforts and resilience building in the communities themselves. And with that, I'd love to invite our panelists to rejoin us, Jessa, Milagro, and Nuntara as well, and Kate to help moderate this conversation. And I'll also invite all of our participants joining us to share your questions through the Q&A portal. And we'd love to ask those to our panelists and hear from them. So with that, Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, and thank you all for your inspirational and powerful remarks. So we have a question that we're going to start it off with, and then I'm going to go over to participant questions through the Q&A function. So as Julia said, please put your questions and your comments there. So for each of you, we can just go in the order that you spoke. From where you sit, what do you see as the grand adaptation challenge for participants to keep in mind throughout this year's CAF series? So what's the grand challenge? And we'll start with you, Nuntara.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Sorry about that. I think actually there have been so many wonderful points that were raised in the in everybody's remarks so far, and I think one of the things that I would highlight is actually seconding something that Secretary Crowfoot raised, which is the importance of regions in really driving resilience and regional action. And I think, given the scale and urgency that we need to move to both reduce emissions, but also drive on building resilience within communities and adapting to the impacts of climate change, really requires us to think creatively about how we enable regional coordination, partnership, and collaboration that is supporting a regions up approach that is also recognizing the unique conditions and values and challenges and also opportunities within communities within that region. So, I think it is really a puzzle for us at the state to figure out how we do that across such a dynamic and diverse state as California, but in a way that also is recognizing that different regions have different capacities. And as Secretary Crowfoot said, a one-size-fits-all is not going to get us where we need to go. So, I think that is one of the big challenges that we really need to start making progress on. There's lots of work that has been going on for decades in supporting regions, but I think how we scale and really drive action at the regional scale is something we need to continue focusing on. So yeah, with that, I'll hand it back to you, Kate.
Well, what do you see as the grand challenge?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I immediately think about is the ways that we need to both start dreaming big and start dreaming collaboratively. I think that outside, before I started working at Mycelium, doing work around adaptation as a person just out in the world that was concerned about the environment, I felt incredibly isolated and I didn't see any actions that were coming out. And I think that now that I'm in the adaptation world, I see the ways in which different regional sectors, government partners, nonprofits are moving to enact change. And I think that if we only think myopically within their own area, we're not going to actually create the kind of momentum that we need to create to enact and to be able to dream big and push harder than we've ever pushed before, because this is it. Like we're so close to climate catastrophe that it is unreal. And so unless we start being able to collaborate across different agencies, across sectors, state partners, and really starting to bring in that grassroots people support so that people outside of adaptation know what is happening and get excited about it and are ready to push with us to create the kind of world that we want to create, then it's not going to be enough. it is just frankly not going to be enough. And so what does that look like when we move across different sectors, when we try to bring in cultures and peoples to conversations that are actually really exciting, but which are held in isolation, and which then causes that sense of isolation and despair that I see so many people, and especially young people, but so many people experience. And so that would be my challenge, is how do we build across sectors? And then how do we bring people in and start letting people know about the work that's happening, which is actually really, really exciting.
Jessa, what do you see as the major challenge?
I'm sorry, I was having trouble hearing the first question to begin with. So if you don't mind just repeating it.
Yeah, we're still on the same question of the Grand Adaptation Challenge. So what should CAF participants be thinking of over the next 5 months as we host these discussions?
I think, you know, we're probably 100 years behind on education with our children and the way that we see that. I think the number one thing that we can do to help the situation is reach to the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds and get them to understand the earth by putting their hands in it, to start gardening, to start learning the relationship with the earth, so that those generations don't make the mistakes that the previous generations have made, right? When they understand the earth, when they have a relationship with the earth, they teach that to their households. They bring that to their parents, right? And to their grandparents and to those who have forcefully been disconnected to the earth. So if we bring these teachings to these children on what the relationship is with the earth, then these children can help their families to reconnect to the earth. And I think that's the number one step, in my personal opinion, is working with our little ones.
Wade, anything to add in terms of your challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I would identify 2 grand challenges. One is, you know, as Lil said, this challenge of collaboration, or I'll call it intersectionality. In government, you know, in my experience, the tendency is to compartmentalize. So we focus on drought, or we focus on wildfire, or we focus on extreme heat. When in fact, we actually have to understand that the climate is changing in sort of a way that's holistically impacting each of these areas, and we need to work across. We also, to New Antara's point, have to avoid this situation where the federal government does its thing, state government does its thing, and local communities. We really have to be led by local communities and regions, and really integrate what's happening at the state level with the regional level. It needs to be one effort. And then as it relates to intersectionality, then we need to bring in these priorities around, you know, redressing systemic injustice and racism, and have that actually shape our climate adaptation approach. So to me, it's how do we move forward in a meaningful way, but in a holistic, integrated way that breaks down silos. And then the second challenge is just how overwhelming and discouraging all of the science is on climate change. And you know, there will be another big international report that was just leaked this morning that suggests this tipping point. And I think a lot of people just don't want to hear it because it's so scary and discouraging. So I think that's another challenge for us all, is to identify that, yes, these are existential challenges, but we can make change. We can make a difference. Last point I'll make is an example that I think, you know, addresses how people are tackling both the intersectionality and just the sense of what can I do. I was in Mono County last week and met the leader of Eastern Sierra Conservation Corps, a woman named Agnes Vianzon, and she is built a conservation corps focused on BIPOC leadership on environmental conservation. And she's doing and leading these affinity groups of trail crews to do work restoring the environment, one all of women, one all of LGBTQ folks. And to me, I'd never seen that kind of creative approach where you're addressing systemic inequity and building a pipeline of diverse leadership in environmental conservation and doing the climate work, but in a way that really recognizes that we need to do a lot within our own environmental movement to redress systemic injustice. So I think that there are 1,000 points of light like that, not to use a George Bush quote, but there's a lot of different sort of points of progress that show just that we can break down these silos and we can actually do something and encourage people to get out there and make change.
Absolutely. We've got a number of great questions coming in, and I'll just pose them to the group, and feel free to jump in if you have an answer that you want to share, some thoughts. So the first question is, what do you see as the priorities for adaptation and community resilience in the state's climate budget?
Well, maybe I just jump in, but I also defer to Nuantara that, you know, the governor proposed a historic amount of funding on climate resilience specifically. And some of it is sectoral, like drought, wildfire, but we are trying to work to connect the dots. And then also through Nuantara's entity, you know, Office of Planning and Research, more capacity building for regional resilience than ever before. So I might point to that, Nuantara, as maybe the most important development is investing in capacity building and the systems that get the state to support regional resilience.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. You know, that investment in capacity building at the local and regional scale really is central to the community resilience package that Secretary Crowfoot mentioned. With, you know, nearly in the California Comeback Plan, what was proposed was nearly 500 million over, you know, 2 and 3 year investment in direct capacity building through the Regional Climate Collaboratives program at the Strategic Growth Council to really stand up that grant program to make direct investment in communities so that community-based organizations and members of communities can actually be at the table, the decision-making, planning, investment table. Another important priority is investing in local governments as well. And we have proposed funding for adaptation and resilience planning grants for communities who are really trying to figure out how to get ahead of these impacts that they are seeing, but don't have the capacity to do so, especially given the significant impact that COVID has had on local revenues and local government revenues. So really focusing there. I think one of the other pieces, and not to get too wonky here, but is also near and dear to my heart, is really dedicated and investment in actionable climate science and research, but really working in a way to bridge to what are the questions that communities are trying to find answers to on the ground, and then really supporting collaborative partnership-based research through the 5th California Climate Change Assessment, really to answer the pressing questions that we have, but not in a vacuum, in a way that is really meeting community needs. So those are a few examples of some of the priorities really focused on community resilience that were in the governor's proposal. There are many, many other significant investments across many areas, but I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Kate.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we have a huge opportunity with the surplus, and it's really exciting to see so much commitment from the administration on these issues that we've been working so hard on. And I think it's interesting to see, if you look at what's happening at the federal level, a lot of funding going to climate as well, but we're not seeing the same focus on adaptation. So it's really an area where California has shown a lot of leadership. So the next question I want to, oh, Lyle, did you want to jump in on that? I see you unmuted.
Yes, so I would just say that I think that there should definitely be more focus. I feel like there's barely any money around climate education and adaptation in schools. So going back to what Jessa brought up, I mean, we're preparing young people for we're currently preparing in a business as usual model, preparing young people for a world that will not exist when they start phasing out of high school and going into college. That we know what the climate science says is going to happen and is already happening. And we're not actually spending any money on being able to prepare young people for a different world, or for a world that is thoughtfully and carefully looking at what does climate adaptation and mitigation look like. And I think that until we have that conversation, when things like, you know, across the nation, like earthquakes, hurricanes, what happened in Texas with the pipes, like there's so much of a helplessness of the future. And that unless we're actually preparing young people and saying, we know that this is coming, this is how we can integrate it into STEM curriculum. It is very, very easy to do. Here's what we need to know when things happen. Here's how you can purify the air in your homes. Here's what it means to start purifying water, that we actually give young people the tools that we know that they will need as they age up. And I think that there definitely needs to be money in the budget to start shifting our focus and stop pretending that the world isn't going to shift and start dealing with the world that we know is coming. I also think there needed to be way more money going towards prescribed burns or controlled fires. I mean, we know that it has already happened in Chico already this year in terms of the wildfires. We know that that's actually, that prescribed burns are actually what helped lessen that danger. And so, being able to focus at least half of our fire budget on being able to start doing what we know works, and that can mitigate some of those effects, I think is really important. And then again, funding for actually community engagement so that people that are out in the world, like in communities, know exactly what's happening. They feel connected. They feel like they're working in sync with the government. They know exactly, what are different plans, how they can get involved when things happen. And so being able to do some of that grassroots educational work to start building trust within communities that might not necessarily have trust in government. And what does that mean, as we look to the future?
Great points. And this next question builds off a couple of those themes that you addressed. So we're coming out of a historic heat wave and facing another disastrous wildfire season. How can we help to build community resilience both quickly and intentionally, knowing that relationship building takes time?
Well, I would maybe suggest a couple of really concrete things. One is to advocate that funding actually make its way into communities to take real action to protect residents against climate change. So a good example is, there's $200 million of urban greening funding that would go to local disadvantaged communities for tree cover and other sort of community-driven green space. One, we need to secure that money through the budget process, and then two, we need to ensure that it gets to disadvantaged communities, including providing technical capacity to those communities that really haven't been successful in getting grants from the state. So I think we're going to have real significant scaled resources to actually make their way into communities. And then I'm hoping that we're really at the state guided by what the community priorities are. So maybe the other suggestion would be, depending on where you're working, really getting involved and making sure that your community has priorities around how it would spend resources building resilience, and that it reflects the needs of the most vulnerable populations.
Jessa, do you want to chime in just on that question of the relationship building?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have relationships with the elders, those who remember times of change and can tell us about like the time when it was law for everybody to have grass, which we know has been harmful and detrimental to California. To be able to give information of, what plant life was where, right? So in the areas that were more foresty, in the areas that were, like what plants went where, because now as Californians, we're always just trying to take control and say, well, I think this would be beautiful here. But was that the original landscape, right? If we can get rid of the invasive species like the yellow mustards that are all over our hills that are feeding the fires, and get the land back to what it was supposed to be and put the right plants in its place, that's going to be relationships with the Native people, relationships with the elders, relationships with those who have the capacity to get into these colleges where we were never allowed, right? To get into archives of information that's been taken from the early settler times, so that we can work together as community to bring the earth in every individual place back to where it needs to be. So that's really where my mind is with it. Get rid of the invasive species and bring the earth back to what it needs to be in each region, right? We've got the wetlands has been destroyed. We need to bring that back to what it was. We have the chaparrals that need to go back to what they were. And when we see that happening, I think that's going to play a big role in lessening the fires that are happening at this moment in time.
Thank you. Lil, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so I would also say going with the places where we know community already trusts, like schools and churches, and building those out as resilience hubs, resilience centers, being able to start thinking about what a public service campaign can look like to be able to get information out to people, both from like a regional governmental stance, but then also using and the tools of like social media, which I think that young people do exceptionally well. And so thinking about like how can we start really creating a PSA, I'm sorry, like a public service campaign that is actually targeted at getting the most information out to people quickly, working with churches and schools to start building them out as resilient hubs. I work with a lot of educators. Educators are hungry for like knowledge and information and education that they can provide and curriculum that they can provide directly in the classrooms, to work with young people, bringing that into like a school-wide level to be able to bring in parents to those conversations. I think that that's really, really important. And then thinking about how we can integrate that to a social media campaign, as so many people are on social media, and then working with young people who are then able to popularize that and to get that to go viral in a way that me as a older 39-year-old woman has, little sense of, but which I know that young people do, and it spreads so quickly. And so being able to think about what does it mean to work with like youth campaigns like Youth versus Apocalypse or the Sunrise Movement, to be able to like spread out messages of like where to go for what, how do we prepare? What does it mean when we have a heat wave? How do we lessen heat effect? How do we, so just thinking about that in a way that can quickly spread the message, and then building that out in a more infrastructural way through schools and churches, who are also, places where people trust, that people go to already, and they feel like a sense of comfortability with.
Great. Yeah. And a lot of comments seconding the need to work with youth, and that having those conversations and preparing our youth to be self-reliant and collaborative can be antidotes to the dread and gloom that can come around this issue, and can address issues around loneliness, as mentioned by one of our participants. A number of you mentioned the need for collaboration at these different scales, at the community, local, regional, state levels. So what are some ways you think that we can collaborate across those levels more effectively?
This is Kimura. I would offer one thing that we hear a lot, which is people need time in their day to actively partner and collaborate and work with people outside of, even outside of just their direct office, or their, in the public sector, outside of your agency. And so I think one, while it is a small step, one immediate thing that can be done is actually thinking about how we create in our kind of job expectations, or within the scope of our work, recognizing that we need to dedicate time to those partnerships, to collaboration, to working together, and that is part of the work and shouldn't be seen as separate, or not a part of the work that we do, to to really get at what Secretary Crowfoot said of like breaking through silos. That means we need dedicated time to be doing that and working together. So we hear often that it's very hard for our local partners to actually find the time to work together, because they have so much on their plate and working so hard to address specific issues. But I think thinking about how we expand that within the work that we all do every day, and making time for that collaboration is critical.
I think it would be really nice to incorporate families in these collaborations, right? It doesn't always have to be an office setting. In my community, we do things where we come together and we make jewelry. And while we're all sitting around the table talking and laughing and making our jewelry, our children are right here playing with each other, and we have our eye on them, right? I think that's a really beautiful way to bring closeness and see that we're all humans, we're all family members, and we can open up to each other in a way that brings a tighter knit community in general. Because one thing I've noticed in the outside world around my community is that people don't believe that community still exists, and my heart breaks for that. So I think in making those kinds of collaborations, we can change that myth that there's no such thing as community anymore.
It's been an interesting byproduct of us all going remote and working virtually, or those of us who have been blessed to have that ability anyway, and to be able to see people's kids running throughout in and off the screen, and pets, and just bringing a humanity that we haven't had in an office setting. So I've actually really enjoyed that aspect. So another question here, it's a long one. So if you guys are following along on the Q&A, you can read the whole question, but basically getting at the science changes, you know, we're operating in an environment that is inherently uncertain. So how do we act at the scale that we need to, as we have, you know, as the science is changing and evolving and keeping up, to make sure that we're accurate and that we are investing in a way that has the most benefit to ensure equity and resilience, but also knowing that equity is time-based as well. And we have to continue to see where our investments are going and weigh that with where the need is and also what's changing in the science. So how do we operate in that space?
Well, I'll observe that's a really challenging question, obviously, and I don't think anywhere, you know, on Earth has figured out exactly how we adapt as quickly and as comprehensively as we need to. I do think we're in a race against time, given these accelerating climate impacts. One thing we're working on at the state, led by New Antara and my colleague Amanda Hansen, is updating the state's adaptation strategy. So our legislature requires us every 3 years for our agencies to update the state's adaptation strategy. And we're taking a new approach this time, which is really trying to build a framework rather than a sort of a report or a plan that sits on a shelf. And that really is focused on not only the actions of state government, but that what we can encourage, you know, across the state, and to connect dots across these different, you know, challenges, whether it's extreme heat or drought or others. I think the question gets at just how are we going to move forward in a sort of a comprehensive and adequate way. And I'm hoping that this climate resilience framework that we're developing this year will help us be more systematic or more holistic with this effort.
Yeah, I would, adding on that, and I think going to the specific point in this question around, you know, climate change planning and the science, you know, and the uncertainty, I actually think we have a lot of certainty in the directionality, right? We may not be able to say on this specific date in 10 years, what will a specific impact be, but we know where the science, you know, and just the lived experience, we know what's happening on the ground and we know the direction we're going. And so I do think there's an important point to not let the kind of questions around what does the future look like, and recognizing that, you know, what we have observed in the past is no longer what we can rely on for the future. So I think we need to acknowledge that, but I also think it's really important that we don't get stuck in this, you know, sense of uncertainty, and that lead to paralysis for action, because I think we know generally what we need to do. We just need to figure out, I think, to, you know, Secretary Crowfoot's point, you know, how we do it at the accelerated pace that we have to. So I guess my call would just be, don't get stuck in uncertainty. We know what we need to do generally, and, you know, we just need to start taking steps to take action.
I have a question. I would love to hear Lil and Jessa's comments on this. So what advice do you have for cities seeking to meaningfully involve youth in resilience building work? And I'll kind of couple this because we're getting towards the end and there's a number of questions. And what are some models of resident-led climate adaptation projects that you've seen?
I think that for cities, there's just engaging with school districts, engaging with specific school leaders at each school, engaging with educators. I am currently in Oakland, California, unceded Ohlone territory, and there's a group of Oakland educators that is, again, ready to go and wants to know how to build curriculum, how to build into their curriculum climate adaptation and mitigation work. I think that that's incredibly important. And then with that, though, is like, how do we support young people and empower young people for youth participatory action research projects? Right. So, and being able to give youth that leadership and that ownership about what they, you know, giving them knowledge around like for example, at Mycelium, we do a lot around NOAA data. We do a lot around eco-mapping their neighborhoods, and then being able to support young people to build out those solutions in their communities and in their schools. And so then thinking about like how young people they'll feel most empowered, or they feel really empowered when they're able to think global and act local. They're able to see what the issues are that are incredibly scary to look at, and then immediately at a localized level create solutions to that or create adaptations to that in their schools. And then being able to give them the tools that they need to be able to then say, I have ownership over this solution. I feel like there's something I can actually do. And we don't just do it from like a science, technology, engineering, arts, and math part, but then we also bring in that piece around ancestral traditions and knowledge. So how has this looked in the past? What does it mean to be in respectful relationship with our world around us, to be able to create long-term change? What does it mean to be able to bring in traditional ecological knowledge to what we are doing? And then to see how creating that change at a super local level empowers young people to then start dreaming bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and being able to enact some of those changes. I think that that's one thing. I think also, adults have a tendency to look to youth for inspiration, and that's it. Like it's, as Jessa mentioned, around a lot of Native communities, it's like a box you check off, versus like, what does it mean to actually be at the table, to have decision-making power, because we know that young people are going to be the most impacted by climate change, to have decision-making power, and to be able to see themselves as leaders and visionaries that can actually enact change. And that means that adults need to be able to create that space at the table, whether that's like building that into their educational curriculum, whether that's building time in as an educator for youth to participate within regional meetings, whether that's paying young people, especially frontline youth that often have to work a job pretty early on to be able to support themselves and to support their families. But it's like being respectful of their reality and actually creating space to not just be a talking point or a talking head, as that young people sometimes are put in that position, but to actually have that decision-making power.
Definitely echoing everything that Little said. Thank you, Lil. I think it's also important too to incorporate music in this whole situation, right? Because for different reasons. One, it's hard to get people interested in caring for the earth at this point in time because they've been disconnected. But one thing I'd like to share is that in my culture, we have been known to use instruments to make sound that creates vibration. We have been known to sing to these plants that creates vibration, and that's part of the relationship we've had with these plants, right? And so I think music brings everybody together in so many ways too, and it brings interest. So if we incorporate music into teaching of the earth and teach that too about the vibrations and the relationships, that's one way to get the community more interested, which will get the community more involved. So different ways, you know, incorporating hip hop heads and people who are interested in poetry and things of that nature, where we can incorporate percussion within it. And then, you know, while there's some percussion and things happening, other people are touching the earth and having that relationship happen. I think that's a really beautiful way to bring community together. And that's something that can be incorporated in all of the elementary schools and all of the middle schools. But again, it does come down to funding, because like Lil said, you know, we can give our time all day if we didn't have bills to pay. So because we all have bills to pay, we need to be compensated for our knowledge and for our work and everything that we do, right? So I'll go ahead and just cut it short there, because I know we're running out of time.
Great, thank you. So I want to wrap up this panel asking each of you to provide your final words of inspiration. It's been a really tough 16 months. We're starting to see signs of hope and light. And as we enter in this new season of hope, what words do you want to leave our practitioners with?
I will go ahead and start. I just want to remind you all that we're surrounded in a world that likes to instill fear in us. But in my understanding and my walk, you're going to be better off walking in love instead of fear. So we don't know what tomorrow brings. We don't know what 5 minutes from now brings. So release the anxiety, release the fear, take a deep breath, and choose here and now to walk in love. And when you walk in love, you attract love. And together we can make a more loving future for ourselves and the world around us. Awesh Goneha. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I would just say to dream big, that you are not alone. I say this to young people all the time. You are not alone. You are walking with the power of our ancestors, of our cultures. You know, we often talk about how we are, that our ancestors have gone through so much, and we'll talk about that trauma, and we'll talk about how that trauma is not just trauma. It is also that experience, that history is also resilience. It is also, like Jessa was saying, it is our songs, it is our prayers, it is the ways that we know to be in relationship. And so when I think about the situation and, you know, our current world, it is really easy to get depressed, to get anxious. And I also think about and remember the legacies of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, of all of our collective ancestors that have been fighting for a better world, and to continue. And in that dreaming big, when I say that, it's how are we also freedom dreaming a different world into being? And there's, and I'll end with this Arundhati Roy quote, which is, "Another world is possible, and on a quiet day, you can hear her coming."
I love that. Thank you.
Well, that would be a perfect final word. But I guess you wanted us to say a couple something. I won't say anything as kind of poetic as our two colleagues, but I will say, I think we have a unique moment in time to actually make a difference, not only here in our communities and in our state, but across the world. You know, California, you know, despite all of our flaws, has led in a lot of areas taking action against climate change. And we know now more than ever, we need a scaled, accelerated effort across the planet. And, you know, if not now, when, if not us, who, or I think I butchered that, but point being, in California, we have an opportunity to demonstrate a model where we're actually integrating our other priorities of inclusiveness and equity and, you know, care for the environment while we're protecting our communities. We have a historic amount of funding. I think we have good alignment among our leaders in Sacramento and in many communities across the state. So I think we have potential to go further, faster than we ever have on building climate resilience in the right way. And that's encouraging to me.
Absolutely.
Well, yes, very hard to follow all of that. Such inspirational insight from all of the panelists here. So I think I would just close out by saying, you know, the solutions are out there. I think we just need to work together and care for each other to be able to bring them to bear. And I just really, yes, would echo everything else the panelists have said. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here today.
Well, thank you all. I know our participants would be giving you a huge round of applause right now, and certainly their comments in the chat box speak to how much they've appreciated all of you being here. And I truly appreciate it as well. You are all important voices and partners in this. And I would say for me, the inspiration has been how far this conversation has come since we first started in 2014. It's so much deeper and richer and closer to the ground than when we first started, and that gives me a lot of inspiration. So thank you all. I'm going to turn it back to Julia for some closing logistical remarks. And with that, Julia, it's yours.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone, to all of our panelists, especially for joining us and taking the time to share your words of wisdom and encouragement and hope. And thank you to our participants for joining us, seeing a lot of things coming in through the chat. I encourage you to do so, since, as Kate noted, we're not gathered in person, but I think if we were, we'd definitely be hearing a very large, loud round of applause. So just to close us out and looking at what's ahead, we do have our full schedule for each of the tracks posted online. So encourage folks to take a look. If you registered recently, you might not have gotten the calendar invitations, but we are sending some invites out to make sure it's on your radar. So coming up, the week of July 12th will be the one to keep in mind and mark your calendars for. We have the the intro webinars for each of these cross-cutting tracks taking place that week. I'll also invite folks to please share about CAF 2021 with your networks. We do have a number of scholarships available to support participation if cost is a barrier. If you head over to californiaadaptationforum.org/registration, you'll see all the information there and a link to the scholarship form, which is rather brief, and to the registration site. So yeah, hoping that folks can join us in spreading the word and inviting more folks to join us. We're at a critical juncture in time where we need more voices at the table. So thank you in advance for any support you can provide there. And finally, just to close things out, we have a lot of challenges ahead, as discussed, really at the intersection of community needs and climate impacts and so much more. But hearing from all of our panelists, hopefully this past hour and a half was a source of inspiration, I think through collaboration and creativity and engaging with our youth and recognizing the inherent power of our communities, or we can absolutely rise to this challenge. So you can see in front of you some of the other reasons for hope that folks shared through the polling feature. So big things rising to the top: youth, community collaboration, also diverse voices, Indigenous wisdom, connections and courage and partnerships, and so much more. So we will be exploring various challenges that the adaptation community is facing, but we're also doing that with knowing that there are many reasons for hope and recognizing that we have made tremendous progress over the past few years. And while there's more difficult work ahead, we can definitely accomplish everything we need to if we're working together. So with that, yeah, we're going to close out. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us. And we look forward to engaging with you over the next few months. And thanks again to all of our panelists, our participants, as well as our sponsors for making this event possible.